This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you again for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network. Speaking of the Parthenon Podcast Network, I'd like to thank Professor James Early of the Key Battles of American History podcast and fellow member of the Parthenon Podcast Network for joining me today. Links to learn more about James and his podcast can be found at keybattlesofamericanhistory.com or in the show notes. You can also search up James's group, American History Fanatics, on Facebook and join there for great conversations. You can now support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon and Subscribestar. By joining on Patreon or Subscribestar, you help keep Beyond the Big Screen going and get many great benefits. Go over to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen or subscribestar.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more. Another way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These ratings and reviews really help me know what you're thinking of the show and help other people learn about Beyond the Big Screen. More about the Parthenon Podcast Network can be found at parthenonpodcast.com. You can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, great movies and stories so great they should be movies, on various social media platforms by searching for A2Z History. Links to all of this and much, much more can be found at beyondthebigscreen.com. I thank you very much for joining me again, Beyond the Big Screen. Today, we are going to talk about the 1943 masterpiece, some might say, World War II film Gung Ho. The movie is very loosely based off of the Carlson Raiders Marine Raiders of the ILN of Macon. And we're joined today by Professor James Early of the Key Battles of World War II. Wait, I am just fumbling all over myself today. We are joined today by Professor James Early of the Key Battles of American History podcast to discuss this, I guess you might say, incredible movie. James, thanks for coming on. Well, we're probably on your show too, so thanks for collaborating on this great movie.
Gung ho, gung ho, gung ho.
Let's just start off because I'm sure most people are familiar with you, but why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. I am a part-time or adjunct professor of U.S. history at San Jacinto College, which is in Pasadena, Texas. That's just south and east of Houston. And I've been teaching for, 6 or 7 years now. And I'm just a huge history fanatic. I've been a history lover all my life. I started a Facebook group back in 2016 called American History Fanatics, and it's grown to about 5,500 people, and we have some really good discussions there and posts about all kinds of things related to U.S. history or American history. I also have done a few podcasts. Probably most of the listeners have heard one or more of them, but I've done 4 limited series with Scott Rank, who also does the History Unplugged podcast, another great one. We did... Presidential Fight Club in 2017, Key Battles of the Civil War in 2018, Key Battles of the Revolutionary War in 2019, and Key Battles of World War I in 2020. And then Scott finally says, get out of here, do your own podcast. So, in a polite way, but he gave me the opportunity to have my own solo podcast, so I did. And of course, one of the first things I did was invite Scott back on to be my partner again, just for a while. I'm going to work with a partner, but different partners, just kind of mix it up a little bit, get different voices in there. So the podcast is called Key Battles of American History. And my intention is to do several seasons, and each season will be either on one particular war or on films. I'm a huge film buff. You know that, you are too. And so I like to talk about war films or just history related films in general. They don't have to be about war necessarily. But so when I kicked off the Key Battles of American History podcast, I started with a series called World War I on Film. And I brought in Sean McIver, formerly of the Come and Take It podcast. And Sean and I talked about 10 different World War I movies. Now, as we record this, it's July of 2021. I'm doing a series on the Pacific War. So it's key battles of the Pacific theater of World War II. And then I'm going to do a World War II on film, Pacific theater only, at least for now, series. And this will probably be part of that series. I'll probably run this with that series. So I've been really busy the last several years.
Yeah. Let's get this whole thing started by maybe just giving us the broad overview of this Macon Island raid that this film is based upon.
Okay, I can do that. Let's back up a step, if I may, though, and let's just talk about what were Marine Raiders in general. Not really that many people know anything about the Marine Raiders. The Marine Raiders were America's very first special forces unit. At least I'm going to call them that. Somebody will probably say, wait, what about so-and-so? But the first major special forces unit. They were conceived of actually as early as the 1930s. There were two men in particular that were the fathers of this idea. They were Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, also called Mike Edson, and even more importantly, Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson. Both of these men were Marine officers who had served in World War I, and then they had spent time in some of the so-called banana wars in the Central American and Caribbean islands during the 1920s and 30s. They'd served in Nicaragua. I think that's the only one, Nicaragua. I might be wrong. I know Carlson was also in the Mexican punitive expedition when Pershing was down there searching for Pancho Villa. And both men had also been in China, and they had observed, although they observed very different things. Mike Edson, he was observing the Japanese forces while the Japanese were fighting the Chinese. I mean, he was stationed with the Chinese, but he focused more on Japanese tactics and learning their system. Carlson was very different. Evans Carlson actually hung out with the communists. He actually got to know Mao Zedong and some of his top leaders. He hung out with the 8th Route Army, and he was very impressed by the tactics used by the Chinese communist guerrillas to fight Japanese troops. From the communists, Carlson learned the phrase Gung Ho, which means work in harmony or work together. And Carlson kind of adopted these kind of left-wing political views. He was seen by many in the top brass of the Marine Corps as soft on communism. I think that's a phrase that was later brought into currency, but they would have applied that term to him. One Marine general said he may be red, but he's not yellow. So both of these men were very interested in taking the tactics that they had observed and applying them to the Marines. And Carlson especially came up with this idea that it would be helpful to have highly trained elite special forces units who could sneak ashore on Japanese-held islands, because everybody knew, even by the late 30s, that war with Japan was very likely. So these guys, they would make raids, they'd gather intelligence about the islands and Japanese forces there, just kind of go in, search and destroy, blow stuff up, raise as much hell as possible, and then get out. And they would be modeled after British commandos. You can also think about today's Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, things like that, but they didn't have those back then. And there was some opposition to this idea. One very influential Marine commander, General Alexander Vandegrift, who was the overall commander of the invasion of Guadalcanal, he didn't like the idea of an elite unit within the Marines. He and others thought that all Marines were elite forces. I mean, think about it. The Marines are supposed to be the tough guys. They're the guys that, go in and just kill, take names, kill and take names, or what, I forget what the phrase is, but they go in there and they're the shock troops. They thought all Marines were elite, but the thing about Carlson is he also had a close relationship with the president. That always helps, doesn't it?
Yeah, it sure does.
Carlson, yeah, it does. It's always nice to have friends in high places. And Carlson had served as one of the guards at the Southern White House, as it was called. Franklin Roosevelt spent a lot of time in Warm Springs, Georgia, had kind of a Southern command post there, if you will. And Carlson was one of his guards. And so Carlson got to know Roosevelt, and he kept telling Roosevelt, here's my idea. Here's what I want to do. I want to make this elite force. And Roosevelt liked the idea. And so he authorized the formation of not just one, but two battalions. And not surprisingly, to command one battalion, they picked Mike Edson. And to command a 2nd Battalion. They picked Evans Carlson. And in fact, I don't want to go on too long, but I could talk about this all day. This is cool stuff. For his XO, or executive officer, and that's his second in command, Carlson picked James Roosevelt, the president's oldest son. And, there was kind of some controversy about this. James Roosevelt was already kind of controversial because it was seen like he was getting favoritism, but Roosevelt turned out to be a great officer. He had health issues. He had back issues. He had stomach issues. He had flat feet. He had to wear rubber-soled tennis shoes into combat instead of boots. But the men absolutely loved him. My dad was in this unit. I forgot to mention that. My dad was one of the first platoon commanders. He was a 2nd lieutenant and then a 1st lieutenant in the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion. So my dad was under Carlson, and he had nothing but good to say about Roosevelt as well. So that's the background of the Raiders. And I'll say one more thing before I turn it back over. It's kind of funny because the 1st Battalion, they were sent to Guadalcanal, and they essentially fought as regular Marines. They never really did any of this slash and burn, search and destroy, get in fast, get out. They didn't really do a lot of that. The 2nd Raider Battalion did more of that than the 1st. In fact, the 1st really didn't do any. The 2nd did some. Okay, that's all I have.
I think that this movie is really particularly interesting because it ties in so closely with the actual events of the battle. If you put it in perspective, the movie was released in December of 1943. The raid happened in August of 1942.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So and I didn't, you asked me to talk about the Macon raid, and I didn't even do that, but I'll just briefly say that this is the first action for the 2nd Raider Battalion, at least. The 1st Battalion, as I said, had been sent into action. They went to a little island called Tulagi first and destroyed the Japanese presence there. And then they went to Guadalcanal, where they had several very tough battles, and they did a great job. The 1st Battalion, I said earlier, they didn't do a lot of the kind of combat that the Raiders were supposed to really be doing. But nevertheless, they did a great job holding off a lot of Japanese attacks. But the Macon raid was the 2nd Battalion's first test in combat. And Macon had some Japanese seaplanes. There was an airstrip. There was a small Japanese garrison. They didn't know how many people there were. It turned out to be about 80 or so. Nobody's sure exactly how many, but they thought it might be a lot more. And the Raiders sent in just a couple hundred guys. That was it. They sent in one company, A company, which had about 130 people or so. And then they couldn't even send in the entire B company, which would have been another 130, because they couldn't fit them. They decided to send them in submarines. So the A company and part of B company piled into these 2 submarines, the Nautilus and the Argonaut, and they sailed away from Pearl Harbor toward Macon Island. And then during the middle of the night, they got off the submarines. They landed on the beach. And I'll just leave it at there. The mission was to go in, destroy all the Japanese defenders of the island. In other words, kill all the Japanese, destroy the seaplanes, just destroy as much stuff as you could. Like I said earlier, search and destroy. And then their job was to get off the same evening. That's what they were supposed to do. Now, things didn't quite work out that way, but we'll save that discussion for later.
Yeah, and the movie is really going to intertwine with the story so much, largely because the screenplay was written based on a account written by an actual person who had participated in the battle, a Lieutenant Lefrancois, who he had an interest. All of these people, and we'll get into that as we go along, all of the people who were involved with this had such interesting lives. But this Lieutenant Lefrancois, he was actually under Carlson's command. Evans Carlson was also a technical advisor for this film. So the film could have been a documentary of the battle, but we're going to see that the film took many, many, many liberties with what actually happened with the battle. Now, the film was only 88 minutes long, so not even the full 90 minutes that a 80s action movie would normally come in this movie. It really, and I almost wonder, this is one of the things I'd love. I know Sean McIver probably knows this, but the movie almost fits to a T the action movie of the 1980s, a 1980s, 1990s classic action movie, war movie. There's the gathering of the band, then there's the training scene, and then there's the combat scene, and that's the movie. It's about a third. You get
and then
the
triumphant ending too, of course.
Yeah,
everything
and
ends up great.
You get a little bit of a awkward romance thrown in there, and boom, you've got a great war picture. And I think that's what they were really probably going for, was this classic action movie.
Yeah, it's very boilerplate.
And in a way, I almost get the feeling that they're creating a lot of that boilerplate, which is interesting. I think the other interesting thing, and it's so thin, the background on this movie, they did not use the actual names of the people, even though Evans Carlson was a technical advisor. Frenchie Francois wrote the paper, the article that the screen play was written on, but they didn't use their names. They refer to Carlson as Colonel Thorwald, although they did use a couple of people. There was a Sergeant Transport, and you had some information on him. He was an actual person from Carlson's Raider Battalion.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
Yeah, they got that right, except that they changed the last name, and I'm not sure if I remember them actually saying his last name in the movie. All I can remember is them calling him Transport, but there really was a Transport. His name was something like Magakian. He was of Armenian descent, and but it was a different. Other than the Transport nickname, the last name was different, at least in the credits. But that they got that right. Transport and Colonel Carlson had served together previously, and they knew each other, and he was very much Transport was a very trusted subordinate of Carlson's.
One of the things that they seemed to really zero in on was the selection of the Raiders. Now, they didn't get the exact people right. They had an archetype lieutenant who was, I'm thinking that he was, I believe in the real story, it was Carlson, James Roosevelt. They were the main ones who were picking the Raiders.
Well, they did all the interviews. They picked all of them. It was much more decentralized in this movie, for sure.
Yeah, they had a gunnery sergeant, a lieutenant, who I think was a kind of an amalgamation of all of the officers, and then they had Carlson picking some of them, who they called Thorwald. I think that one of the interesting things was that I think that the movie kind of, if it didn't get it right, it got the right feeling, is that they picked people who were a little bit unconventional to be in the Raiders. And do you think that was that's accurate to say that they weren't picking maybe the perfect spit and polish Marine necessarily for that outfit?
Well, there's some truth to that. I want to say first, it is interesting that there was no executive officer. There was no equivalent to Jimmy Roosevelt. I thought that was kind of interesting. It was Carlson and then a bunch of lieutenants. But yeah, there was one line in there where one guy just says, "Well, I just want to kill Japs," And by the way, everybody, I apologize for the racially insensitive term, but that's what they said back then, and that's what they say in the movie. So I'm just quoting from the movie. And Thorwald says to him, Thorwald/Carlson says, "Well, that's not good enough. You can do that in any branch of the Marines if you just want to kill the Japanese." And in reality, Carlson was looking for people who kind of had an ideological reason for fighting. They wanted to fight for their country. They didn't just want to go out there and have an adventure. And because a lot of people signed up for the Marines or the other branches because just for revenge, they wanted to kill Japanese, or some of them just wanted adventure. They just wanted to get out of their farming town that has 200 people, and those are the wrong reasons. So I would say they got the big picture right, even though they may have missed some details. And I think that's true. I don't know if it's the wrong time to say this, but I think overall the movie gets the big idea correct, even though it misses a lot of the details. And we're going to talk about a huge detail that got changed. We can do that later on regarding the ending. But yeah, I thought the recruiting scene was good. It was, and the training was good. They really did a lot of the stuff they showed them doing. They really did. They learned martial arts. They learned knife fighting. They learned how to hike like 25, 50 miles in one day with almost no food or water. Carlson was determined to make this the absolute toughest unit in the entire U.S. Armed Services.
That's what I think that they really nailed, is that Carlson was not running this. And it came through in the movie as well, that he was not running it as a classical Marine, or what you would archetypally think as a Marine operation, where they're, always at attention and they're everything on their uniforms perfect. Like, that was not what he was going for.
Yeah, that's right. And they did a great job in the movie on this. Carlson said, I'm going to make things much more democratic. There's not going to be all this saluting, and there's not going to be all this emphasis on rank. I mean, they do have to follow his orders and whatnot, but he would discuss the plan with people. Like, he'd get together with all of his men, not just the officers. Everybody was equal, to a certain degree, as much as you can in the Marines. And he would say, well, what do you think of this idea? We're going to go up this hill. We're going to flank. This unit will go around this side. This unit will go. He would tell people the plan and solicit input. And sometimes he would change his plan based on what people said, even if it was a private. And then afterward, he would kind of have a debriefing, and he would say, well, what'd you think of that? How did we do? What could we do better? And it wasn't just this business of, well, you're going to do what I say because I'm the colonel, or, I'm the lieutenant, I'm the sergeant. You do and don't question. He actually encouraged discussion and questioning. And like I said, they didn't always wear rank insignia and things like that. So that they got that perfect, I thought.
Yeah, like every time he would come and talk to them, come on, boys, come in, smoking lights lit. And they would all gather around and everybody starts smoking. And I have the feeling that that probably wasn't classically what would be going on in any military outfit, let alone the Marines.
Right. And that's another thing that made the top brass so uncomfortable. Not just Carlson's political views, but the fact that this unit was just so unconventional. It's just too democratic, too radical. Another thing that I liked what they did is Carlson was not one of these guys that was just always yelling at people, oh, what are you doing? Like some of the stereotypical, I mean, that's usually a drill sergeant that does that, but sometimes officers would do it too. But Carlson was very soft-spoken, quiet. I mean, certainly he could yell, and sometimes he would lose his temper, but he treated people with dignity. He felt like every person should feel welcome, feel wanted. He kind of, what's the word? He kind of presaged, or he was a harbinger of a lot of the management training of the 80s and 90s, and even today, make people feel wanted, give them a voice, things like that. That's important. But back then that was unheard of in the military.
He also, in the movie and in real life, they did a lot of calisthenics of stretches and squat thrusts, and I think they call them burpees these days. But they did a lot of things like that, cardio exercises, which I'm thinking, again, there's so much speculation with this movie in particular, because I wish that somebody should write a book about how they made this movie, because I think that would be fascinating. Mm-hmm. But I'm thinking that a lot of that came from his experience with the Chinese, because that was a kind of a team building activity that the Chinese would do a lot, is early morning calisthenics to get everybody together.
Yeah, every branch did calisthenics. I mean, they did calisthenics in the Army, in the Navy, and so that wasn't completely radical, but I think the kind of exercises that were done, I think the Raiders did more than even regular Marines would do. And I think, like I said, they put a lot of emphasis on martial arts and knife fighting and other things that definitely probably came out of his time in China. And he spent 3 terms in China, I should say that. I don't know what the total number of years he was with them, but he was there, went home, did other stuff, went back. He went to China a total of 3 times, which is really amazing.
There's it's getting into the training montages, and like you said, there was so much martial arts and knife fighting, and that's one of the things a lot of people say with this movie. It's basically they did the training knife fighting, and then they showed the battle knife fighting, just lots and lots of knife fighting with the same choreography. There was 2 really big factors with the movie is Carlson. I love this as Scott Rank came up with this, the conversation with destiny. Every other thing was just Carlson monologuing to people about his ideas. I mean, the movie was fairly thin on dialogue, but there was a lot of monologuing.
Yeah, I think there always is in a lot of these movies. We've talked about other ones where they did that. And keep in mind, this movie, as you've already touched upon, this movie came out in 1943. By then, the Raiders were already famous. And again, it helped that they had the president's son as the second in command, and they had FDR on their side. It must be nice. It must be nice to have Roosevelt on your side. Anyway, to paraphrase Hamilton, they need to make an FDR musical. There was a lot of publicity. The Raiders were these heroes, and they turned this raid into this amazing triumph over the Japanese, which it really wasn't. It kind of was, but there was a lot of screwing up in it, and more on that later. But the film came out, and it was a propaganda piece, plain and simple. And when I say propaganda, I always explain this to people. Propaganda does not automatically mean to something bad. Propaganda is just any type of government issued communication, if you will, whether it be articles in the newspaper or TV commercials or posters or movies like this. But it's designed to build morale. It's designed to get people to think a certain way. And we have to remember, the Macon raid was in August of 1942, and it had not been all that long since Pearl Harbor. It had been less than a year, and people were still stinging. And this was they needed to make this into a big victory. Okay. They needed it to be, the Marines finally went in and kicked some butt, because Guadalcanal had just started, and it was not a foregone conclusion that we were going to win Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal was a huge back and forth struggle for many months. So they wanted to make this into the first clear American victory. Now, of course, by the time the film came out, we had won Guadalcanal and we're already involved in some other offensives. But nevertheless, this was something the American people needed. They needed some good news. And so they weren't going to make this bad news. I kind of got off a little track there, but that's kind of why they have these speeches in the movie to let people know we're doing this for America. This is to fight tyranny, and this is to save our country and make us free, keep us free, things like that.
Yeah, I think that, propaganda was the word of the day, and they had, you think about it, 88 minutes to get in all these fight scenes and get their message across. There was not a lot of time to build up a lot of intricate dialogue to get that through. And I don't think people necessarily wanted that either, necessarily.
No, there's no character development. It's just, training, like you said, get on the subs, land, go in and kick some butt and get out of there. That's what the movie's all about. That's how you could summarize the plot, like in 30 seconds.
I think before we get into the actual battle scene, because we'll be able to get into a lot of real interesting history there. I think it's so interesting, the language they use in the movie. They, for one thing, the way they talk in that, kind of the dialect they use and the accent they use, it's so common that you hear it in films, but I wonder if people actually talked that way. You really have to. The movie's pretty widely available. It's for free on Amazon. And you can get it on a lot of other streaming services.
Yeah, it's on YouTube too, free.
Yeah, and you should definitely go and watch it. There's obviously the issue. They do use problematic language when they refer to the Japanese. Be prepared for that. But it was so toned down, I think, in a lot of ways with the language. Like the one person said, instead of malarkey, so malarkey was stretching the limits of their swear words. Instead of using malarkey, he said Milwaukee. So
wow.
it's so funny and that was just that was one. There was a couple other instances where I think it's so funny that they had no problems. The scenes were fairly graphic for that time period of the fighting scenes, but then the language and the saltiness in that way was just turned down to practically zero.
Yeah, it's funny because Sean McIver and I have talked about this before several times. When you watch a movie about a past event, the movie tells you as much about the time when it was made as it does about the actual time in which the events took place. So, you watch a movie made in, say, the 1960s and early 70s during Vietnam, and they're going to be a lot of anti-war themes.
Mm-hmm.
You watch one made during the 40s, especially when the war is still going on. It's all just, USA, USA, rah, rah, rah. I'm not saying that's bad, by the way. Like I said, that was needed. But I've watched a lot of 1940s World War II movies lately. I get maybe not a lot, but I've watched a half dozen or so. And it's funny. They all say swell all the time. Oh man, that was swell. And they say dope. Like, what's the dope? And they probably did use those terms a lot at the time, but it is interesting. There's, of course, because of the strict standards at the time, there's never a real swear word. And then you watch some from the late 50s on, and you start to hear some damns and some hells. And then, you watch something like the recent Midway movie, which they kept it to PG-13. So there's some, scatological language, and there's one F-bomb. But then you watch other ones like The Thin Red Line, which was R from 1998, and there's quite a few F-bombs floating around. And it makes you wonder how they really talked back then. But I know that they did use some pretty bad language, even by today's standards, because I've read some accounts from the time, like the Guadalcanal Diary talks about they used a certain 4-letter word that I can't print, and of course you know what that is. So, anyway, it is interesting.
Let's get into the actual battle scenes, because I found that the battle was very confused in the movie, and through doing a little bit of reading, it seems like the actual battle was really confused as well.
Oh, it was. So as I mentioned, they got on a couple of subs. The subs actually were surfaced most of the way, because a submarine could go much faster on the surface than it could under the water. So if you're using submarines as transports, which they were, and by the way, they showed the insides very accurately. The subs had to get rid of some of their torpedoes just to make room for all these men. And they had these cots, or these bunks that were stuck to the walls of the sub, and they were 4 or 5 high. And you had like maybe 18 inches, maybe even sometimes 12 inches between you and the one above you. And they were just packed in there like sardines, and it was hot. And they even put special air conditioners on these subs, but it was still got up to 90 degrees where the men were sitting. And the trip took about 8 days or 9 days. 9 days. They left Pearl Harbor on August 8th, and they landed on Macon on the 17th. But they were surfaced for most of the trip. But nevertheless, the Marines didn't have anything to do. There wasn't anywhere to go. They would try to go up top some, but they couldn't all be on the deck, right? So a lot of the time they just sat there in their bunks, and they felt really claustrophobic. And there's one scene in the movie where one guy starts freaking out and about to kind of have a nervous breakdown, and another guy kind of talks him down and calms him down. But that was very accurate. The way they were just like so packed in so tightly. Let's see. I was supposed to get into this. So the sub arrived on the 17th, and the plan was for them to pull out these rubber boats, and the rubber boats were going to have outboard motors on them so that they could get to the beach pretty quickly. The subs couldn't get super close to the water. They knew that there were going to be planes. They didn't know how many Japanese planes were there, and maybe planes would come from another base nearby. So the subs tried to stay as far away as they could from the beach. So the Marines got on these rubber rafts, and in the movie, it looks pretty clean and pretty easy. They just jump in and off they go. But in reality, they were on the Pacific Ocean side of the island, and the waves were high, they were choppy, and the wind was blowing, and these waves were just going up and down as much as 10 feet. And so the men had a hard time getting into the boats cleanly without breaking something or without falling into the water. And then they took off, and the motors it was raining, and the motors got wet, and they got fouled, and they weren't working. So they ended up just tossing a lot of the motors into the water and coming in with paddles. So it was a very messy landing, but the movie makes it look very clean. I'll stop there for now.
So they wind up getting onto the island. What was their real objective on the island? Because I think that got kind of muddled in the movie. Like, what were they actually there to do?
Yeah, they didn't really go into that too much. The island is very narrow and skinny. So if you think about, I'm going to do one of my famous mental maps here for the first time ever on Beyond the Big Screen.
Yeah.
If you think about think about a flying saucer, like the traditional idea of a UFO, or maybe a Frisbee. So they're landing at the bottom of the Frisbee. Okay. So the island is very long from east to west. I may be wrong on the east to west, but as they're coming in from their perspective, they're landing at a 90-degree angle to the beach, of course. So from their perspective, from left to right, it's really long, but from top to bottom, it's very narrow. And on the opposite side, on the lagoon side, because this is part of an atoll, it's not too different from Tarawa. The Japanese had some piers. Well, first of all, there was an airfield in the middle, and then there were some piers and a command post and different buildings where the Japanese were hanging out on the opposite side. So the Marines were planning to come in like before the sun rose. Okay. They were going to come in when it was still dark, super early in the morning, like 5 a.m. or something like that. And then they were going to land and quickly move across the island to the far side where the Japanese were, wipe them all out, destroy the seaplanes that they believed were there, and they were, and destroy as much of the command and communication structure and all that, and then get out that same evening. What happened was, though, they lost the element of surprise because one man's rifle went off. And they didn't really show that in the movie. In the movie, they just kind of went in and immediately they were hit with the Japanese. But what happened was, in the real battle, they had originally achieved surprise, but when this rifle went off, the Japanese were alerted. Pretty soon they were fighting the Japanese. The Japanese came after them. And it became very, what's the word, kind of diffused or decentralized. They didn't act as an organized battalion. Okay. They were broken into small groups. In fact, one of the companies was completely separated. They'd landed in the wrong place. Like the current carried them way off to the left of the others. And the main body didn't even know what happened to them, but they got involved with a lot of fighting. And I think that was pretty accurate. But the thing is the Raiders didn't really get to do a lot of damage on the Japanese installations on the first day, which is not what's shown in the movie. In the movie, they fight, and then they finally blow up all these Japanese buildings, and that's it. One thing that was very accurate is there were a lot of Japanese snipers in palm trees, and the Japanese were masters at concealment. And so one guy would climb up in a palm tree. He'd have leaves on his body, like he might have a palm leaf or two, and they were almost invisible. And so the Marines would be going across, not thinking to look up, whoever does, right? And then all of a sudden, poof, somebody would get hit and down goes the Marine. And then the Marines would go up and start shooting at the palm tree, but they weren't sure what tree it came from. They weren't sure where exactly in the tree the sniper was. And so it was very confusing and chaotic. And it took them a long time to clear out those snipers, and that they do a great job of showing that in the movie. If I remember correctly, the first person to die is the victim of a sniper.
Yeah. I think it was also difficult in the movie to get a sense of scale. The Marine Raiders were a company and some change. So how many men was that approximately? Well,
the Raiders were a battalion, which is almost 1,000 guys, but only a small number went. There were 5 companies, maybe 6 eventually, lettered A, B, C, D, E, and I think there was an F company as well. I'm drawing a blank here. I'm having a senior moment. Okay, work with me. But But Carlson took Company A, which was about 130 people, and part of Company B, which was 80. He wanted to take all of Company B, but they couldn't fit him on the sub. And by the way, Carlson went in person, and that's shown accurately in the movie. Roosevelt went. Jimmy Roosevelt also went. Of course, he doesn't exist in the movie. But yeah, it's very confusing. The movie was actually filmed in California, so the terrain looks nothing like it does on a tropical island. But it is very confusing, but I think that's actually a plus, because I think you get a picture of how confusing it was for the Marines. They just, the plan fell apart, and pretty soon groups of 5 or 10 were fighting a Japanese group of 5 or 10. And before eventually they did get organized. Again, it's similar to the Battle of Tarawa, but on a smaller scale, much smaller scale.
And how many Japanese were involved?
Well, let's see. There were, I don't want to get this wrong, I think there were, well, about 70 or 80, but they had no idea. As I said earlier, Japanese were really good at concealment as well as defense in general. Carlson didn't know. So, they came in, the Raiders came in with about 200 guys, 211 to be exact. Japanese had 70, but they thought there were many more Japanese, at least at first.
Now, what were the Marines Raiders actually there to do? Was it to just wipe out the island and wipe out all the garrison on the island?
And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
This was the easternmost Japanese installation. Okay, this was the closest Japanese base to Pearl Harbor, and the Raiders, as I mentioned earlier, they were kind of like today's Navy SEALs. Their job was to go in, like I said, early in the morning when it was pitch black, surprise the Japanese. They'd actually dyed their uniforms black. They'd put face paint on so that they were hard to see. They were going to destroy the installations there, kill as many Japanese as possible, take a couple prisoners if they could, which of course, that doesn't normally happen. Gain intelligence on the Gilbert Islands in general, and to divert Japanese attention from the Allied landing on Guadalcanal. Now, the Allied landing had already started on Guadalcanal, but this would kind of throw the Japanese off and confuse them, thinking, there's going to be 2 major attacks, when in fact this wasn't designed to be a major invasion like Guadalcanal was, and like so many others would be later. This was a raid. Their job was to get out of there by the end of the day.
Was this I got the sense that this was a proof of concept to see if this Carlson's way of raiding and his ideas could work. Would that be accurate to say? That is exactly right, Steve. This was kind of putting them to the test. So the one thing that I think the movie, I think it kind of got right, kind of got wrong. Well, maybe you can explain it more. One thing that Carlson really worked on was very small team tactics, and he had a rifleman, a machine gunner with a Browning automatic rifle, and then a person with kind of like what we might call an assault rifle, the Thompson submachine gun that had a high volume of fire. We won't I know you're don't get into too much equipment talk,
not too much.
But generally the idea that these small 3-man teams could work independently or get put together into building blocks, which is really a really modern idea. How did that work out for him?
Well, it was, as I said, the situation was very confused on this raid. And as you said, this was kind of a trial run. They're going to have another operation later on Guadalcanal called the Long Patrol. And listener, if you haven't heard my episode on that, please do. It's the 4th Guadalcanal episode. Yes, I actually did a 4-part mini-series on Guadalcanal within my overall series. But yeah, they had teams of 3. One man would carry a Browning automatic rifle, which was very heavy, very bulky. One would carry an M1, which was the standard rifle that was used by most Marines as well as Army. And then another would have a Thompson submachine gun, which, as you said, was high volume, fast, just when you think about that. Short range, but nevertheless very effective because the Japanese tended to close the range on you. And you could plug those groups of 3 groups of 3 with one more overall commander. That would make a group of 10. That would be a squad. And so, yeah, they were designed to be able to work in larger units, like 10 guys or maybe even 20 guys or even more, up to the level of a platoon or a company, or they could work as individuals, not individuals, but like in groups of three, a 3-man team. So that was very flexible. And that was Carlson's idea. That was an innovation he introduced. And the Marines actually, long after the Raiders were disbanded, spoiler alert, that happens long after this movie takes place, but not too long, actually, a couple years after the Raiders were gotten rid of, and the people who were in the Raiders were put into regular units. They kept that idea around, that the idea of the 3-man team. So yeah, that was really cool.
But then, as in the film version, and I wonder how much that modeled what really happened. It seemed like everybody just kind of kept rushing from one place to another, and then they would get charged by a big rush of Japanese, and they would all just and it turned into something more of a typical battle scene than this choreographed 3-man teams and fire teams, then squads and that sort of thing.
Yeah, there were times in this battle when people were operating as individuals, for sure, as chaotic as it was, but yeah, maybe they emphasized that just a little bit too much. I'm not sure.
So then what winds up happening? They're in this raid. They get some of their objectives. They destroy a couple of buildings. What winds up happening at the end of that first day?
Well, let me say I want to talk about one other scene that it was a great scene, but it was total Hollywood. Do you remember the part where they went up on a roof and they painted an American flag on the top of one of the Japanese buildings?
Yeah.
Like the Japanese are not going to hear that and go up there and shoot them or something. Maybe the Japanese were away, but eventually they got back to that building and they thought, if we do that, if Japanese planes show up, they'll think, oh, the Americans have taken this over and we'll bomb it. And they did. And a lot of Japanese are killed by their own pilots, but that's ridiculous. I mean, they would not take the time, and they did not take the time to paint an American flag on a big tin roof. And I don't know that the Japanese pilots would be fooled by that. That was it was fun, but it was total nonsense. To answer the question, in the movie, okay, this is a spoiler alert, folks, but you should still watch the movie. It's fun, and it only takes up an hour and a half of your life. But in the movie, they just go in, kill all the Japanese. Of course, some of the Marines get killed. There's a very young Robert Mitchum in this movie, by the way. This is one of his first movies. He's like 24 years old or something. But they go in, they wipe out all the Japanese. Some Marines are killed, and then they get back to the beach, and they go away, and everything's just great. But that's not how the battle really happened. What really happened was, in real life, when the Marines got away from the Japanese and headed back to the beach, they couldn't get on the subs because the weather was so bad. There was so much wind. The seas were so choppy that the men on the boats, remember the motors had been tossed because they just weren't working and they were just too heavy. So these Marines are trying to use paddles and sometimes even their hands to get over these 4, 5, 6, or even higher foot waves back to the submarines, which were several hundred yards off the shore. And they just couldn't make it. And a lot of the Marines, including Carlson and Roosevelt, didn't make it, and they ended up getting basically thrown back to the beach. So the Marines, some of them made it to the subs, but the majority of the Marine Raiders ended up spending the night on the beach. And they'd lost a lot of their gear. Most of them did not have a weapon anymore. They didn't have hardly any food. They were doing good just to get out of that storm alive, swimming through that water. And so they're sitting there freezing cold on the beach, no weapons, no food, no nothing hardly. And I hate to say this because I like Evans Carlson a lot, but Carlson despaired a little and he actually considered surrendering. And so there's even some books have claimed that Carlson actually wrote a note and sent one of his men to go find a Japanese person in command, if there was anybody left, and offer their surrender. I don't believe that. That just doesn't seem true at all. But Carlson still thought there were a lot of Japanese there. As it turned out, there weren't hardly any left alive. So the Marines spent the night on the beach, and then the next day they kind of Carlson got a second wind, so to speak, and I think he began to realize how few Japanese there were, and so he gave up. He ditched the idea of surrendering, and he took the men back in, and they found almost no Japanese left. And they ended up getting out, and everybody got back to the subs on the second day, except for 9 men. It took them all the way until they got back to Pearl Harbor, and then they realized there were 9 Marines missing. These are not ones that have been killed. These are ones that just got left behind because they were lost and they weren't with the main body, and things were just so chaotic. They just kind of forgot about them. And sadly enough, I'll give the epilogue. These 9 men were eventually taken by the Japanese to the island of Kwajalein, which was called Execution Island, and they were executed by the Japanese. So very bittersweet ending, very messy, much less triumphant, much less, inspiring than the movie. The movie was very inspiring. But of course, again, like I said, this is 1942, 43. They're not going to let the American people know that, oh, we totally screwed up the first attempt to get off of the island. Not that they screwed it up. They just couldn't do it. It was impossible. And we almost surrendered even. But then we finally made it off. That's not a very inspiring message that you want to share with the American people. That's not a big victory. So I think that's why they changed the story so much.
Yeah, I think that was the really difficult part, that by that point they couldn't physically get their boats. I think they had said that some of the boats had tried 9-10 times to get out of the atoll, and they had ditched every piece of equipment they had, even down to their uniforms and their dungarees they had ditched.
Yeah, some of them were almost nude.
And that is a very different story than what the movie portrayed.
Exactly.
So maybe let's get, I guess the movie takes us off that this is an absolute success, mission accomplished. But I mean, what would you give? You're a professor. How would you grade Carlson on this raid?
Well, I would say the raid was not his finest hour. I think this was his first time to really command troops in combat, and it was certainly his first time to. I mean, he'd had some commands in some minor. He was a lower officer in World War I and in the so-called Banana Wars, but this was his first time to fight Japanese in the Pacific and to lead an elite unit like this. And I think, honestly, he gets a C. I think he made a lot of mistakes. I won't go into a lot of detail about that. There's books about it, but he was a little bit indecisive, and he was not quite like the colonel in the movie.
I think that leads in really well that, so he has this kind of C range accomplishment of this command, that he was really so much responsibility was given to him. What's kind of the rest of the story with Carlson? Well,
as I mentioned earlier, he was given a second command. He took several companies, several hundred men. They dropped in behind Japanese lines on Guadalcanal, and they were there for a month, and they worked their way around, and there they did more of what you would think their training was for. They ran into a lot of small pockets of Japanese soldiers. They killed them, destroyed a lot of Japanese supplies. They gained intelligence on where the Japanese were, and they basically kind of scared the Japanese that were remaining, that didn't get killed, and pushed them off of the east side of the island. And in doing so, they helped relieve the pressure on the Marine perimeter around Henderson Field, which was kind of in the north middle part of the island. And the Japanese had attacked it several times, but after this long patrol, they would not ever do that again. And so I think Carlson gets an A for that operation, the long patrol it's called, or Carlson's patrol. But like a lot of the Marines on Guadalcanal, he got sick. He became very ill with malaria, and I think some other issues as well. He had to be sent back to the States, and he was in the hospital for a while and stayed on the West Coast for a while, during which time he helped advise this movie we're talking about. But Carlson, I think we touched on this earlier, he was not completely trusted by a lot of the Marine top brass, and he basically got put in the penalty box, or, sidelined. He was sent down to AAA. Let me mix as many sports analogies as I can there. He was obviously kept in the Marine Corps. They didn't just, they couldn't, there wasn't any reason to court-martial him. You can't court-martial someone for their political views, but and he was a big hero, a perceived hero for the Macon raid, and really a true hero on the long patrol in Guadalcanal. But he was never given another command. He served out the rest of the war as in observer roles. He was an observer at Tarawa. He was an observer at other battles. Just kind of helped out, gave advice, things like that. But he never actually ever commanded again. And he became sick, and he died at a relatively young age. I'm drawing a blank on the exact year right now, but I'll call it up in just a second. But I don't think he even made it to 60. So that's the rest of the story on Carlson.
It's so fascinating that he has kind of a mediocre first test. Do you think that, and then he has a pretty unqualified success, and then he gets sidelined? Do you think that, and is the scholarship out there thinking that it was that because he was considered communist? Was it positive? Was there any thought that surrender issue was hanging over his head?
I think that was a part of it, but I think most of it, different people, some Marines that were there deny that he even suggested surrendering. And some say that, as I said, that he even was going to send a note. That might have been part of it. That was certainly kept under wraps. They didn't let the American people know about that, obviously. I think it was just I think it was mainly his political views and his unorthodox style of running a unit. I think people high up said, these are the Marines, dadgummit, we're going to salute, we're going to wear uniforms. Not out in the thick of combat. Nobody saluted officers in battles, because as soon as you salute somebody, bing, a Japanese sniper is going to take them out. But he was just way too unconventional. This democratic spirit, this, allowing the men to question his decisions and things like that. That just wasn't Marine enough. That was too radical, too weird. By the way, he died in 1947 at the age of 51. He didn't even make it. Didn't make it to my age right now.
Oh, wow. Because if you look, people can go look at pictures of him pretty easily on the internet. He looks a lot older than 51.
Yeah, he was just a true leatherneck, leather-faced, grizzled old veteran. And he just had been through so much. The body couldn't take it. Was
Roosevelt, why do you think that Roosevelt might not have kind of helped smooth things over? Because Roosevelt was, the President Roosevelt, that is, was quite a benefactor to Carlson all throughout his career.
Yeah, Roosevelt was not a super micromanagerial type of leader. He tended to let people run their departments and do what they wanted. He just didn't want to mess with the Marines' business. His philosophy was let the Marine generals, who were longtime veterans, let them run the Marines. They knew the business a lot better than he did.
So then I think the epilogue of this is so much of what Carlson set up with his Raider Battalion became the norm in many respects to how special operations works throughout the rest of up until the modern day. Do you get the sense that people, is he honored or memorialized in a way as somebody who was a real pathfinder, at least in the Marines?
I think in the Marines, yes. I'm not sure how well known he is outside of, Marine Corps circles or historians circles, but I think there's a move now to kind of raise consciousness about Carlson's career and what he did.
And you say that was really that after this Macon raid and then some operations on Guadalcanal, that it pretty much just faded out, these Marine Raider battalions.
Well, the Marine Raiders lasted another, let me think. At the end, Guadalcanal ended in early 1943, so almost another year. They actually ended up forming two more battalions. Jimmy Roosevelt was the colonel and the commander of the 3rd Raider Battalion. There was a 4th. But again, there were just too many people in high places that didn't like this idea of what Carlson was wanting to do. And so they formed the Raiders into a Raider regiment. All 4 battalions were under one colonel. And then eventually, and they did fight. Some of the battalions fought in different places. They fought at Bougainville, which was one of the larger islands in the Solomons, not too far from Guadalcanal. Another battalion fought on New Georgia. It's New Georgia, also in the Solomons. But finally, what happened was Alexander Vandergrift became the commandant of the Marine Corps. That's the head honcho of the Marines. He was, I mentioned earlier, he was the Marine overall commander at Guadalcanal, and he was very anti-Raider, not a big fan of Carlson. When he became commandant, that was it. And after he became commandant on January 1st, 1944, and by February 1st, 1944, the 1st Raider Regiment was redesignated the 4th Marine Regiment. So it just became kind of with a stroke of a pen, a regular regiment. So the Raiders didn't the men just didn't go away or anything. They just became regular Marines.
I think that I wonder what you think too. I think that this would be a great movie of a remake. I think that there's so much material there to work with.
Yeah, it would be really great. And it would be, and I think nowadays they would make it more realistic. I think it would be great drama to show these guys trying to go across these incredibly choppy seas and high waves to the submarine. And then half of them don't make it and have to go back and then spend the night on the beach and they despair. I think it would be a fantastic movie.
I think they could also, Carlson is such a fascinating character, and it's somebody who has so much going on with all of his experiences, and then putting this outfit together and having all of the things that he had done with the Chinese communists. I think that would be just a fascinating person to really kind of delve into his psyche and really develop him more.
It really would be. He was a fascinating character, kind of a walking contradiction. He was very religious. His dad had been a congregational minister, and so he was a very devout Christian. And yet he's part of this unit that part of the interview process was he would say, "Would you have any problem at all slitting the throat of a Japanese soldier?" And if there was any hesitation, the person would be rejected. So, I mean, this killer, this search and destroy, go in and kill everything and get out. And yet he's this devout Christian who he always carried a Bible in one pocket. And he was also an intellectual. He loved the classics of literature. He carried a volume of Emerson in his other pocket. So he's got the Bible in one pocket, Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson. So he's kind of this nerdy, literature loving, Bible loving, praying, deadly throat cutting Marine all at the same time. It's fascinating.
Yeah, he's just one of those people who's very difficult to pigeonhole. And I think that was probably one of his biggest challenges and why he didn't go up further in the command, is that he didn't quite fit any mold. Right.
He was not the prototypical Marine officer. And like I said earlier, the guys up higher, what do we do with this guy? He's just too weird. We can't have this guy move up through the ranks. Now, he did eventually become a general, but it was mainly for ceremonial reasons, just to honor him more than he certainly never commanded any kind of large body of soldiers.
Well, I want to thank you so much, James, for talking about this movie. I love it. I think people, for all of its problems, which it has many of them, I think you get, and like you had said earlier, you get such a sense of a time and a place through this movie that it's almost a historiographical source as anything.
Yeah, it is. And I should say, too, one more thing about Carlson, if I may. Carlson was totally loved by his men. My dad talked about him until his dying day. My dad loved Colonel Carlson. And in fact, my dad had he taught ROTC at a high school in the Houston area for 12 years after he'd retired from the Marine Corps. And he kind of, this program was kind of falling apart, but he whipped him into shape and he built it up, and he had hundreds of people in the ROTC. And the men, I don't know if my dad initiated this or if some of the students did, but they called themselves Early's Raiders. And they made a flag that had the same emblem as Carlson's Raiders, in honor of Carlson, in honor of my dad's service under Carlson. My dad actually was transferred out of the Raiders after Guadalcanal. By the Battle of Tarawa, he was in a regular unit. But yeah, Carlson was just an amazing guy. And he would, like you said, it would be a perfect movie because he's such a contradiction. He's so fascinating. He's this, but no, he's this, but no, he's this, Anyway, sorry, I just had to mention my dad. I always try to work my dad into every discussion, but My dad loved him.